So we have established that most of you have got your Christmas decorations down. That Christmas has been well and truly eradicated from your homes. You can buy Easter eggs in the supermarkets. Although that's probably been true since November, so, Valentine's Day cards will soon make an appearance. Hot cross buns will fill the shelves. But it's still Christmas. Epiphany is on Tuesday, the day when we remember the visit of the Magi, the wise men, and the changing of the season from Christmas to Epiphany. Our Reformed tradition pretty much ditched the seasons of the church. John Knox, the great Scottish reformer, thought that Christmas was just a load of nonsense. He might be right. A couple of hundred years ago, it was still illegal to celebrate Christmas in Scotland. Christmas wasn't really celebrated here until after the war. It was, I think, 1956 before Christmas was a bank holiday in Scotland. People just went to work. That's why Hogmanay became such a thing here. It was a kind of unofficial winter solstice celebration. The changing of the year was outside the governance of the church. It was one of the few things that they couldn't say, well, you can't do that. We seem, though, to have thrown ourselves wholeheartedly into Christmas, though. Shops go big, don't they? It's an opportunity to sell loads of stuff. Christmas stuff was out before Halloween had happened. Artificial trees mean that you can put your tree up whenever you want, way before the 1st of December, or earlier. And most of us, by the time Christmas comes, are a bit fed up with the whole thing. Some of us put our decorations away on Boxing Day, because that's it, done. Christmas is finished. It's happened. We can't wait to get back to some kind of normality, which is odd because we can't wait to get our Christmas decorations up. But it just seems to last forever and ever and ever and ever. The advent calendars are in the bin. The chocolate contents are long gone. People go back to work on Monday, back to school on Monday. We're in that weird period where people go into work and they sit and they look at their computer and wonder, what is it I do? Perhaps that's just me. We have bodies that are in recovery mode, full of cheese and crisps and alcohol. It's a perfect diet, isn't it? People are still clinging on to those last remnants of the holiday, though, aren't they? The kids don't want to go back to school tomorrow. But we all need to get back to normal at some point, don't we? The anticipation of Advent, I think, is really rich and important. But sometimes all that waiting just gets a bit too long. Sometimes the anticipation passes us by in our busyness. We've just got so much to do that we forget to wait. We forget to anticipate. We forget what it is that we're waiting for. It all seems so long. And most of you start to complain, at least by week 2, that we haven't sung any Christmas carols yet. And then Christmas is over in the blink of an eye. Flurry of wrapping paper, cooking for 100 people, all that stress and then collapsing in a heap. And the promise that next year it'll be different. We won't spend quite as much. We won't have quite as many people for dinner. We'll take the time to enjoy it and to relax. Who's made that promise every single year for the last whole of your life? When everything's packed away and all that we're left with is a few extra pounds and a long, long, long January where beans and toast becomes our new favourite meal, and the nagging feeling sits in the back of our heads that we might have missed something. And I don't mean that present that you bought that you still can't find. But it's still Christmas, at least until Tuesday. Or if you're Episcopalian, you can go all the way to Candlemas in February if you want. we still have the chance to discover something about the birth of Jesus that's important. And perhaps once we take down the decorations and everything goes back to normal, perhaps that's actually one of the best times to do it. After all, that's what it was like in the first place. A young woman gave birth in the middle of ordinary people going about their ordinary lives just like us. We've been working our way through Matthew's Gospel through Advent. We had a quick visit to Luke on Christmas Eve because, well, shepherds and angels. But Matthew and Luke both locate their story in very particular moments in time, and they're very careful about doing that. Luke tells us about something that happens, a census. And to tell us when that happens, he says, well, Augustus was the emperor and Quirinius was the governor of Syria. We could check. We can go and look that up. History books contain that information, except they don't tell us that there was a census when Quirinius was governor, but let's gloss over that. Matthew tells us that Herod the Great was king. Locates his story in a time and place. But unlike Matthew and Luke's Gospels, that's not how the story is presented in the amazing prologue to John's Gospel. As John sets the scene for what is to come, this story that he's going to tell us about Jesus, the case that he's going to make, he does something really, really different. John sets the scene in a way that's completely outside of time. He invites us to step away from our clocks and our calendars and to consider something altogether bigger. Something even more profound. Something with much further reaching consequences. I think we've become used to prologues recently, haven't we? The story before the story. The prequel, almost. Prologues sometimes introduce characters that are going to be important. They sometimes tell us something about the setting, the context, and they tell us something about the themes that are to come. They do locate the story. And so John locates the story, doesn't he? In the beginning. Hold on. We've seen those words before. The first words of the Bible, in the beginning. In the beginning, what? In the beginning, God created. And the first thing that God creates is light. And the light was good. Very good. John takes that idea and he gives us more, way more. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was God. What? The Word was God. The Word was with God and the Word was God. That's confusing. The Word was in the beginning with God. But for John, the Word has another name. Christ. Christ was in the beginning with God. So when God creates the world, someone else, the Christ, was part of that creative process and part of God. Christ is the Word. And in the Greek, that word is logos. And logos is much more than a word on a page. Logos is everything that's connected with the idea that the word conveys. So when I say table, you're all thinking of a table. But you're all thinking of a different table, aren't you? Well, how would we know? Some of you will be thinking about a desk. Some of you will be thinking about the table that you sat around at Christmas dinner. Some of you might be looking at that table and thinking, oh, there's a table. We know what a table is. But we also know that tables can be completely different. They have constituent parts, and the word table sums up the idea of table, but it doesn't tell you what the table's like. It doesn't tell you what colour it is. It doesn't tell you what shape the legs are. It doesn't tell you if it's round or square or rectangle. We need more words to help us to define. What about coat? I said coat, what do you think of? You're thinking of a big winter jacket? Probably today because it's freezing. Does it have buttons or a zip? And does it matter? At what point does it not become a coat anymore? What's the difference between a coat and a jacket? Words are small, aren't they? They help us to think of big ideas, but they don't contain all of it. They can't contain all of it. Words are a shorthand to something else, aren't they? A shorthand to an idea. And that's important because words have to convey ideas. We have to have a shared understanding of what that means. If you think a chair is something else, then we get into trouble, don't we? And it's where most of our arguments are, actually, about the understanding of what we mean. Translation always falls short. Because logos is both the word, the thing, and the idea of the thing. So when we say words, it's not really just the word. It's the whole thing that the word tries to encapsulate. So when God speaks words, let there be light, it's so much more than a sentence. It's about the idea, the concept, the totality of light in all its forms, in all its possibilities, in all the ways that it is and could be, and in all the places that that might happen. It's such a big idea. John tells us something amazing. That it was the word, the logos, that co-created the light and everything else. And in that creative process, God and the word, the logos, embarked on, led to not just a load of stuff, but resulted in the creation of life. And it's into that life that the word, the logos, the Christ would enter. And that life, that singular life, that version of life would become a light that shines in the darkness. Because that one life contains all of life. Every possibility of life. Every life that has ever been, that is and will ever be. And that light shines in the darkness. And the darkness can never overcome it. And that's a really comforting thought, I think, in a long, cold, dark winter night. But it's not the end. Because all of that feels a bit distant, I think. It's a bit far off. It's way back in the beginning. And yeah, something happened, but that was a long time ago. It's nice, it's comforting, it might even be profound, but it feels far away. It feels a bit like God is elsewhere. It feels a bit like the word is separate from us. It's quite different from us. So I'm glad that John's not finished, because the word becomes. The word becomes flesh and lives among us. Perhaps the most important sentence in the Bible. Just a minute ago, the word was creating everything. The whole of the universe and everything in it. Right there at the beginning of all things, and now suddenly the word has become flesh and lives among us. And John tells us that we have seen his glory, the glory of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. Wow. Wow. For John, there are no angels, no shepherds, no Mary and Joseph even. No wise men, definitely no donkeys, and probably no innkeepers. Just just, the creator of all things, around since the beginning of all things, part of God, but in some way also separate, choosing to be born in flesh and to live among us. And just as the words that we use to describe that are really important, so are the things that separate the words. Punctuation gives our words form and meaning. Punctuation matters. I think I've mentioned this before, but how we talk about God matters. The grammar that we use to speak of God matters. We need to be very careful sometimes. We need to be quite precise sometimes about how we describe God and who God is and what God does and who God is not. And sometimes the punctuation is the most important part. Comma makes all the difference, doesn't it? Let's eat, Grandma. Let's eat, Grandma. It's a very different Christmas dinner, isn't it? Just because you missed out a comma. Commas are important. Commas are important because they separate the clauses of a sentence. They help us to understand who or what the sentence is about. The Word became flesh and lived among us, comma. And what's weird about that is it could be a sentence on its own. It probably should be a sentence on its own. In the Greek, there is no punctuation, so somebody somewhere has decided not to put a full stop and to put a comma. Because there's more. More that's not separate from that first part. The Word became flesh and lived among us, and there's more. The Word became flesh, something solid, something that we can see and touch and smell, something that we can understand. And that's amazing. But the thought of the very essence of God becoming flesh is something that's perhaps just too incredible for us to get our heads around. That God would become human and live a human life just like us is amazing. Some translations say made his home among us instead of just lived. I like that idea, but it's a bit settled for me. It's a bit fixed, a bit stationary. My favourite translation is that the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. Excuse me. Tabernacle. It's a good word. Do you remember what the tabernacle was? So the tabernacle was a tent. God in the wilderness, remember when the Egyptians, the Hebrew slaves were wandering around in the wilderness, God lived on the mountain. And Moses went to meet God on the mountain. And that became really, distant. Why was it only Moses that got to meet God? Why was God so far away? And so God decided that, I'll come and live among you. Build a tent. Let's call it the tabernacle. And so they built a tent. And God came and met them in the tent, in the centre of the community. I love the idea that the Word becomes flesh and tabernacles, that is in the tent, because the tent moved every day. The tent went where the people went. It wasn't just a building like this that everybody came to. The tent went with them when they moved around. They would pick up the tent and they would move the tent, and God would meet them the next day in the tent. I think that's an incredible idea. That God goes with us wherever we go. But we have to ask the question, why? For what purpose? Why on earth would God do such a thing? The next part of the sentence tells us more. And we have seen his glory, comma. So the glory is the Word's glory. because it was the Word that became flesh, and we've seen that glory. Remember in the story of Moses, when Moses went to meet God, his face shone and the people were afraid. Moses had to put a veil on because the people couldn't look at him. They were just too scared. Moses was transformed by his encounter with God. But it was all too much for everyone else. So Jesus comes and looks like us, but we still see God's glory in that. We still see his true nature. That's what glory means. Glory means the revealing of someone's true nature. And as the Irish comedian Jimmy Cricket often said, come here, there's more. The glory of a father's only son, comma. So that tells us something else about the Word, doesn't it? It tells us that the Word is the Son of the Father. That Jesus' glory, that Jesus' true nature is the true nature of God. That if we've seen Jesus, we have seen God. And what's that like? It's full of grace and truth. The Word, the Son of God, the Christ, shows us what God's true nature is because we have seen him. And he's the same as God. So God is full of grace and truth. Jesus is the light in the darkness because wherever we look at him, we see grace and truth. And those things are good and pure and true. No evil can exist in those. So the darkness can never overcome it. That one sentence tells us everything about Christmas. Everything. It tells us in a way that Matthew's wise men and Luke's shepherds and angels just can't. Sure, it requires us to do a bit of work. Sure, it requires us to think, to look at the grammar, to have a bit of patience, to use our imagination. But for me, and I hope for you too, this sentence means everything. Everything. Much more than trees and tinsel and turkey and presents and mince pies even. It means everything. The Word became flesh and lived among us, comma. Because it's not the end. It's not a one-off thing. It's not a thing that only happened in a particular place in a particular time when the emperor was Augustus and the governor was Quirinius and when Herod was the king of Judea. For John, this is an always and forever event. A thing that happens every moment of every day. I said in the beginning that the Reformers didn't really like Christmas. They didn't like it because it took away the importance they thought of Easter Day. Of the idea that resurrection happens every day. Not just one Sunday in spring. I think the same is true for Christmas. That when the world was dark, when all the decorations and the lights were packed away, and when the city was quiet and everyone had gone back home, gone back to work, gone back to school, gone back about their daily lives, when everyone was busy, just getting on with stuff, God came. God crept in beside us. God made God's home among us. And no one knew. No one knew. Only a few. A few who dared to believe that God would do something different. The few that continue to believe that God is doing something different. The Word has become flesh. and lives among us. Amen.